For an Iraqi perspective on the Chilcot report, I'm joined now by Ali Allawi, who served as Iraq's first post-war defence minister and later finance minister. Ali Allawi, thanks for joining me on UpFront. Do you believe Tony Blair will ever face some kind of prosecution at an international or even domestic level for launching what many call an illegal war, a crime of aggression? Should he be prosecuted, in your view?
Well, I think there are two questions here. Whether he will be prosecuted, I doubt it very much. I find it extremely difficult to see how a former prime minister would be brought up to trial. It would create a huge traumatic event in the political life of this country. But whether he should be is, I think, a question that has to be decided by those who felt directly grieved by what had happened in Iraq, in particular the family of some servicemen as well as Iraqis. They would have to bring a case against him. In my personal view, I think he needs to be chastised. He needs to make a very open and formal apology, which he hasn't so far.
Many Iraqi exiles living abroad back in 2002, 2003 supported the US-UK war against Saddam Hussein, the invasion of Iraq. They wanted to get rid of Hussein's dictatorship no matter the cost. Did you?
I was public about my opposition to any invasion, let alone an occupation. But I think it's also a bit of a false accusation to imply that the entire Iraqi opposition was cheering for a war. In fact, a large number of leading opposition figures made it clear that they would not welcome an invasion of the country as a way to get rid of Saddam.
You say you didn't support the invasion, let alone the occupation, but you then went on to serve in Iraq's post-war government. You were appointed as the first defense minister by the interim Iraqi Governing Council, which itself was appointed by the Americans in 2003. Why did you take that job? Why did you make yourself complicit in the disaster of that US-led occupation of your country?
No, complicit, I think, is far too strong a word here. The fact that the deed was done, and there's nothing that I could do to stop a whole chain of events, a steamroller that was put into effect, not in 2003, but was put into effect soon after 9/11. And the fact that I had spent nearly my entire adult life in opposition to dictatorship, and the dictator was removed, albeit by an outlandish act, an outrageous act in many ways, made me responsible for taking a part, at least as much as I could, in the process of reconstruction and recovery.
And that's a very fair point, but you use the word that's a very fair point. You use the word responsible. I mean, you wrote an entire book about the occupation and the failures of the occupation. Therefore, are you not responsible for some of those failures, having served in that quote-unquote occupation government, the US-appointed government, before elections?
Well, first of all, I was not appointed by the US government. I was appointed by the Iraqi Governing Council, which was an independent body, appointed by the United States, but approved by the United Nations. We have to make that clear.
Okay.
I did not accept an appointment to work in an occupation authority. It was an Iraqi Governing Council that had UN sanction.
The violence in Iraq has been unending since 2003. Almost 300 people were killed in Baghdad last weekend by ISIL. More were killed yesterday in Baghdad. ISIL didn't exist before the war. How much responsibility should Tony Blair, George Bush, the architects of that invasion, how much responsibility do you think they should take for these ongoing deaths in Iraq?
I think they are responsible to the extent that they grossly mismanaged the post-war landscape in Iraq, and they pursued programs and policies that fed into creating the kind of deep resentments that led to the outbreak of carnage. But there's no question in my mind that ISIL and ISIS and all those Al-Qaeda connected groups were around, probably in the shadows in the 1990s, and they were established and they were given a life of their own well before the Iraq invasion. They sort of grew and expanded after the occupation because the soil was fertile. But you can't deny that these groups had established themselves firmly in the mindset of the world of jihadi Islam well before the occupation of Iraq.
And how much responsibility should Iraq's political elites, Iraq's leaders, take for failing to provide security to the people of Baghdad and of other such cities which have been repeatedly hit by suicide bombs, car bombs and the rest? A lot of Iraqis are angry, aren't they, at the incompetence, the corruption, the weakness of their leadership?
No, there's no question about that. I think the Iraqi some political class has a great deal of blame to take on, a great deal of responsibility for what has happened, because they've proved to be a uniquely incompetent and venal group that is incapable of managing the huge crises that we have faced in that country. And they, in fact, contributed through acts of omission and commission to the breakdown or the dysfunction of the state. Certainly after the US and the UK withdrew in 2010, I put the blame squarely on the shoulders of the political class that grossly mismanaged the affairs of the country and led us into this near abyss.
Ali Allawi, there are many who would argue that the Iraqi government won't be able to defeat ISIL until something's done about the intense sectarian divisions inside of Iraq today. Would you agree that, for example, human rights abuses by elements of the so-called Shia militias, the popular mobilization units they call themselves, helps ISIL recruit, it helps ISIL feed off the resentment, the fear, the paranoia of the Sunni minority in places like Fallujah and Mosul?
Yes, I mean, it's one thing feeds into another, but you have to understand that when these so-called militias, in fact, they are connected to the Prime Minister's office and they also have legal sanction. I don't want to think of them as out-of-control groups that go around death squads and so on. They're not like that at all. Elements of them, perhaps small elements, fringe elements, do commit excesses, and there's no question about that. I'm not trying to hide this fact. But they came to the scene after the Iraqi army collapsed, and after Daesh or ISIS was within a few miles of Baghdad. So without the sacrifices of these people, Baghdad would have been overrun in 2014. Now, they've taken a certain life of their own, a certain status of their own. They're playing
with a great deal of Iranian involvement too, would you agree?
Yes, no doubt about that. I mean, Iran is probably the central most important element in the organization and the command system of the popular mobilization forces. But nevertheless, the bulk of these people are committed patriots, and they have fought, and they fought in many cases quite valiantly in defense of not just the.
But there have also been accusations of war crimes, as you concede. How do you put the sectarian genie back in the bottle in Iraq? Can it be done? There was yet another suicide attack by ISIL on a Shia mosque just yesterday in Baghdad. How do you put that sectarian genie back in the bottle?
I don't think it's been ruptured totally, but we have to start a very long and laborious process of confidence building between the sects. And there's many places that one can start with. But over time, I think the good sense of Iraqis will I think, overcome the strong sectarian demons that have been unleashed. But there isn't a demand, as it were, to run the country in a strictly sectarian way. It does not make sense to have, for example, a Shia state in Iraq while ignoring the civil and political rights of other communities. The fact that we had an unbalanced state in the past doesn't mean that these errors should be repeated.
Ali Allawi, thanks for joining me on UpFront.
Thank you.
That's our show. UpFront will be back next week.